Hello, everyone.
Hello.
Thank you for coming, and thank you for your patience. I would like to welcome you all to our NVCL Local Author Series with Daniel Calla, and opening for him is Patricia Corbett Bowman. Before we begin, let me introduce myself. I'm Heidi Schiller. I'm a librarian here, and I'd like to thank the Friends of the Library and the North Shore Writers Association and 32 Books tonight for helping make this evening happen. 32 Books is selling Daniel Calla's books in the back there. I'm sure he'll be happy to sign them later. And then Patricia is selling her books as well. So without further ado, let's start the evening. I would like to introduce Kathy Scrimshaw, who is the former president of the North Shore Writers Association and one of our awesome partners in the Local Author Series. Welcome, Kathy.
Thank you, Heidi, and thank you also to the Friends of the Library and those members of the North Shore Writers Association who are always coming out and volunteering at our table. So it's my pleasure tonight to introduce Patricia Corbett Bowman. She is, like so many of us who live here on the West Coast, a transplant from Eastern Canada. Patricia was born in Toronto and lived and taught school for many years in London, Ontario, where she honed her storytelling techniques on her young students. During that time, she also had numerous short stories and articles published in several different journals. Now, Patricia's first novel was, in her own words, a middle-aged woman's chick lit mystery, which is a far cry from what she's here to speak about tonight. But she diligently worked at that chick lit mystery and reworked it and edited it, as all good writers do. And then a good friend of hers, whose opinion she respected, told her that her voice as an author was more suited to young adults. So the offshoot of that conversation was the novel that she's here to read from tonight, titled Back in Her Time. It was published in 2011. Now, like Daniel Calla's novels that he's here for tonight, Back in Her Time is a novel set in World War II, and it's set in Italy. It was inspired, at least in part, by Patricia's father's experiences during that time. And it came out of the fact that after her father passed away, Patricia was going through his war memorabilia and did come across his war medals, and so began to look into his time in Italy during the war. Now, one more thing I'll just say about her book. Publishers like to slot authors into a particular genre or publishing slot. It makes it easier to market and sell books. Patricia had a hard time with that when she was sending out her books, and like all of us, collected numerous rejection letters. But she found her slot when, after her book was published, OpenBookToronto.com placed Back in Her Time in the second position in their books to buy for the holiday season in the political history section. So we have here to start out tonight a political historian novelist. Please welcome Patricia Corbett Bowman.
Thank you very much, Kathy, and thank you, Heidi, for having me tonight. And I hope I'm a good warm-up for you for Daniel. As Kathy said, I started Back in Her Time thinking about my father after I got all his war mementos. And once I started doing the history and the research, I got away from my father. But I did make one of the characters, the grandfather, who is also the young sergeant in the book. I did sort of make him a little bit of my father. My father was a strict disciplinarian, and we never understood as children why. But as I got older, I started to see the light. And after having my own family, I really saw the light. One of the things that I collected from my father was a handkerchief. And this on here says, it's He trained at Camp Ipperwash in Ontario, and this was the 29th Infantry Training Center. And I guess handkerchiefs were really big. I know my father used to like to get them for Christmas years ago. And all of the soldiers would get one of these. I'm not sure if he stole it out of the mess hall or if he was given it. But his brother also had one. And after my aunt read back in her time, she remembered that her brother, my Uncle Ed, had also received one during the war. And she went and found it and sent it to my cousin Paula and said, "Your dad sent this to me during the war. I thought you'd like it." So it's kind of nice that I wove the handkerchief into the story. It's in the present and in the past. And as you say, as you listen, it's a story of a young girl in the present time who is one day at her high school locker with her friend Dieter, who's of German descent. And something horrific happens at the school. And this girl, who is a goth child, garbed in black, has EVIL tattooed across her fingers, has a tongue stud, a real edgy character. Suddenly, she is thrown back inexplicitly to World War II, and she ends up sitting in a slit trench next to her young grandfather. She has no idea how she got there, and he thinks she's a young soldier. And the whole premise of the story is, how did she get there? How will she get home? And how will she get along with these straight soldiers when she's been such an outcast back in her own time? Will she settle down and will she fight the Germans when she's handed an Enfield 303? At one point she says, "Hey, I don't know how I got here. I don't want to fight." And this is when they think she's a zombie, which is a Canadian word for a conscientious objector. So they think that's what she is. And as time progresses through the book, they also think that she's a little addled, that she keeps making predictions of things that she thinks will happen in the war, because she remembers her grandfather telling her these things back in her time. And her memory isn't too good, and she never really listened to her grandfather, as young people don't. And so she tries to remember things that he said, and she often thought he had Alzheimer's when he used to refer to her and say, "Oh, remember when we were in the Leary Valley? Remember when you caught that soldier?" And now she's realizing he was talking about this time in the past when she was there with him. And I'll read a little bit from one of the chapters. Here she has been trying to tell her grandfather who she is by predicting things, and he hasn't gone for it. He comes up to her, he calls her Junior, as most of the soldiers have nicknames, because she's so young looking and she's a lightweight. Just heard another story about you, Junior. Is it true you saved an American soldier from a minefield when you were returning from the field hospital? I didn't actually save him, sir. He jumped into the jeep I was in and saved himself. That's not quite the way I heard it. You gave one of your predictions again. Something about knowing where the enemy had planted those mines. Wasn't it, Junior? Yes, sir. How did you know, Junior? Sir, I could tell you, but you wouldn't believe me. This is the moment I've been waiting for. I'll tell Pops who I really am now. Look, I don't want to get all the men all riled up with all this hocus-pocus nonsense. It was probably a lucky guess that saved that American's life. Let's keep this to ourselves. Do you hear me? Yes, sir. Tiller lowered her head and marched on by rote as the sergeant fell back towards the rear. He'll never believe me. He's as stubborn here as he was back home. Will I ever get a chance to tell him who I really am? And you might notice in that little chapter that I had the Canadian save the American. After growing up with American TV and American movies with American heroes, I thought it was time the Canadians came in and won a few battles. So you'll see that. And some of them are actual battles that I've mentioned in the book. And a couple I've just thrown in as fiction. So back in that time, Wayne and Schuster were young comics. They were on the radio, and they were live at theaters. Lorne Greene, who later became famous as the father on the Ponderosa Show, he was the voice of doom on the radio. And it kind of gives you an idea of the time. Teenagers like to drink sodas, milkshakes, and eat hamburgers. That hasn't changed too much. But back then, that was the kind of thing when Taylor went back in time. She wasn't getting that kind of food from the mess food. She was getting vegetables, and often it sat in tallow, which is what we call grease today. I also wanted to talk about my other book. It has just come out in the last couple of weeks, and it's called Tim, Cookie, and a Matter of Security. And this one, again, I wanted to do historical research because that was my newfound genre, according to Open Book Toronto. So I did a lot of research, and I found out a lot about past prime ministers of Canada. But I didn't want to set this one back in time. I wanted to go a little forward. So this book takes place slightly in the future. The second prime minister, female prime minister, has been installed at 24 Sussex. She was elected, unlike Kim Campbell, who was appointed by her party. Police in the future have radio implants. They don't have to worry about carrying little radios around. Justin Trudeau has already been the Prime Minister. Port Vancouver has had the big oil spill. And the climate change was disastrous. Florida is mostly underwater. The prairies are dust. But marijuana hasn't been made legal yet. So I may be off on that one. We'll see. Yeah. And the Green Party has morphed into the Enviro Party. And this is the party that has come into power. But this is all backstory to my characters. My characters are the children of the Prime Minister who move into 24 Sussex. They are 11-and-a-half-year-old boy, and he's very excited about moving into this old mansion from the 1860s. His friends back in North Van have told him they're sure that there are going to be secret hideouts, secret passageways, and all kinds of fun places for him to explore. But his sister, 16-year-old Cookie, is not as thrilled. She had to leave her bad seed boyfriend, who is charged with possession, back in North Van. She's not allowed to call him or visit with him. It would be bad for her mother's press. And, thanks, Dan. She is very angry and does not like to have the RCMP accompanying her wherever she goes. This, to her, is the worst that could happen. So in her mind, she wants to get away from them. And the family isn't allowed cell phones. If you remember what happened in England with the royal family and with movie stars, their cell phones were corrupted. So the family isn't allowed cell phones. So she's very upset about that. So she's trying to call back to Vancouver to talk to her boyfriend. She's having a hard time. And she's trying desperately to get away from her RCMP escorts. And she does manage to. She gets kidnapped. And while she's off trying to escape from her kidnappers, the young boy Tim is left to wander around the house, as young boys do. And he finds some keys in his mother's big den and goes down the pool hallway for the Pierre Trudeau pool and wanders down there and starts trying keys. And he finds a lot of things, and he finds a lot of secrets, and some may even lead to helping get his sister back. So the one chapter I wanted to read there was Tim with one of his finds. Tim couldn't believe his eyes. This room looked like a submarine control center from one of his games. Lights were blinking on a console with all kinds of knobs and dials. Computer-like screens were lit up with dark images and ghostly figures. Tim stared and stared. One screen showed a ghost moving around what looked like dark woods. No, it was a figure that looked a lot like his dad, highlighted in a red haze. A high-backed leather chair swung around and faced Tim. Welcome, Tim. We wondered how long it would take you to find us. You're pretty good. It took the Harper kids a week to discover us, and accidentally, too. They didn't have keys like you. Ben happened to be on his way to the pool when one of the former guards opened the door. What is this? Looks like spy monitors, said Tim. You were standing in Security Control Central, or SCC. And in case you don't know, I don't know if the RCMP knows that this room exists either, but in my mind it does. I just wanted to mention that. They haven't been at my door yet, so maybe they haven't read the book. Tim, I'm Mr. Clark, head of the evening shift of the RCMP detail. Clark stuck out his hand and Tim shook it. Hi. Is this like some big secret I'm not supposed to know about? You mean like the Deepen bunker you entered this afternoon? Clark said. You know about that? Tim was flabbergasted. Yes, Tim. We have to keep a watchful eye on your family, especially your mother. Back in the 1990s, someone broke into the residence and found their way to Prime Minister Chrétien's bedroom. Mrs. Chrétien practically ran into the intruder. The PM and Mrs. were able to lock themselves into another room until help arrived. We realized then security wasn't tight enough in the residence. We now have cameras and plenty of guards to keep your whole family from harm's way. Cool. Would you like to see where your dad is right now? That's him walking in the woods. I see him on that screen. Wow, that's too much. Do you have cameras like that in my bedroom and such? No, Tim, not the rooms. Your family has to have some privacy, just in all the hallways. And we use satellite signals like the one we're looking at your father with. So you knew I was on my way here all along? Afraid so. We couldn't have you wandering outside, getting lost or into mischief, could we? Yeah, I guess. Tim wondered if his parents and sister knew about this control room. The Prime Minister and Mr. Brown have had a complete tour of the residence, including the SCC. The rest of the detachment is stationed across the street at the back of Rideau Hall. You have nothing to worry about, Tim. Your family is safe here. Thanks, Mr. Clark. Wow, I had no idea all this stuff was hidden away. Can you keep it to yourself, Tim? We don't want any security breaches. Sure, Scout's honor. Tim saluted. What about my sister? Does she know about this? Not unless your parents have told her. You could keep it to yourself, Tim. Sure thing. I don't tell my sister everything anyway. And I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Patricia. Okay, and now I'm very pleased to introduce Daniel Calla. Daniel is the internationally best-selling author of 8 books. His most recent, Rising Sun, Falling Shadow, was published in September. Daniel is a frequent public speaker, presenting on a manner of topics. His speeches address the content of his books, as well as his professional and personal experiences as a doctor. He practices emergency medicine in Vancouver, where he lives with his family. Please welcome Daniel Calla.
But I want to thank you guys all for coming out. Thank the North Vancouver City Library for having me, and 32 books for being here, for selling some of the books. That's always nice. You know, it's I still, and I thank Heidi, by the way, for getting the books right. I keep getting introduced with fewer and fewer books. They say it's my 7th book, my 6th book. I'm going to get introduced one day as having never written a book before. It's unbelievable. But you know, over the years, I have been lucky enough to combine my 2 careers, my 2 passions really, which are medicine and writing. And I've written about the potential for patient abuse in a book called Rage Therapy. I've written about antibiotic resistance and superbugs and the threats to society they pose in a book called Resistance. I've written about the pitfalls of DNA evidence and blood lies. And the deadliness of prions and mad cow disease and cold plague. And of course, I've written about pandemics before too. So I guess I shouldn't be totally surprised that one reviewer once called me, or said of me, that Calla is like Chicken Little with an MD. You know, I still work full-time in the emergency room, so people often ask me if my worlds collide. Because, and I do actually, more and more of the patients I see in emergency, or I shouldn't say more and more, some patients in emergency, or let me rephrase it, one patient in emergency recognized me for the books I wrote. And actually, she was crazy, that she was psychotic, but that's another story. She really was. But the strangest thing I've ever done, tonight was a bit intimidating, getting lost, being late for you all, but the strangest and probably most intimidating talk I ever gave was to the psychiatric grand rounds. I did that about 5-6 years ago when my book Rage Therapy came out. And I don't know if any of you have read Rage Therapy here, but it's not a terribly complimentary book to psychiatrists. It doesn't, you know. And so I was a bit nervous to begin with, and then when I got up there and discovered that my talk was called The Misportrayal of Psychiatrists in Fiction, and there was like 100 psychiatrists in the room, I was quite nervous, and I got in there and I looked around the room, and you know, there weren't a lot of friendly faces, I gotta be honest with you. And I started talking, and I got about 2 minutes in the talk, and somebody started waving his arm like he was trying to land a plane at the back. And you know, I couldn't ignore him. I wanted to, but eventually I kind of pointed to him, and he said, you know, he stood up, and he said, I read your book. And there was like this malignant pause. He must have waited like 20 seconds, just staring at me. And he said, you portray all psychiatrists as unbalanced and inappropriate. None have any personal boundaries. All of them have completely effed up personal lives and relationships with their patients, and even their own families. Even your heroes completely screwed up. And then he stopped again. It was this agonizing pause. And he kind of looked at me and shrugged, and he goes, well, you pretty much nailed us. And it was like the best icebreaker of all. So I'm going to take a moment to preempt a question I invariably get, and that is, where the hell do I find the time to do this writing? And I want to throw up something, because I do still work full-time as an emergency room doctor. I'm still at St. Paul's. But no one who knows me would ever mistake me for one of those annoyingly ultra-efficient type of people. You know, someone who in an average day seems to be able to paint a house and teach his child Japanese and canvas for a charity and on and on. I have friends like that, but I am not that person. If I have time on my hands, I can make a shower and a shave an all-day ordeal. I swear, you should see my lawn. It's unbelievable. And my garage is beyond description. I think it's possible Jimmy Hoffa's remains are somewhere down there. But my advantage is my drive, you know. When I sink my teeth into something, I do so with an obsessiveness that borders, well, it is obsession. But, and you know, particularly this writing, and when I start to write, everything else suffers for this writing. Except I try to follow the rule, I don't let my family time and my kids and wife be affected too much by my writing. But everything else gets put on the back burner. I stop watching all my favorite TV. Fortunately, Breaking Bad has ended, so that's another hour of the week I have, you know. But I even stop reading for pleasure when I'm in the middle of the first draft, when I get to it. And of course, when it comes to pursuing dual careers, I do have a huge advantage in being an emergency room physician. We really are shift workers, and I had a lot of free time during the week, particularly when the kids are at school and my wife's at work. That's my ideal writing time, so I'm very lucky in that way that I get to write Monday to Fridays when I can. And you know, pursuing two careers like this, it helps to keep both interesting and exciting for me. One feeds off the other. I work in the ED, especially meeting new patients who give me a glimpse into their interesting and sometimes troubled, sometimes sad, sometimes wonderful lives. It all fuels my creativity. And my writing offers the perfect outlet for a stressful day to a long shift. In many ways, it's reinvigorated my appreciation of my work life. It's amazing how isolating writing is. You can comment, but it's funny when you're holed up and in the middle of a novel, you are alone for a long time. So I like getting back to people and I like getting back to work. But you might ask why, after writing 5 or 6 thrillers, medical thrillers, mysteries, why did I switch to historical fiction? And why, of all places, World War II Shanghai? Excuse me. Well, it's a true story. I was being interviewed after my first novel, Pandemic, came out. It was a big interview. It was with the Reader's Digest. And the interviewer was lovely and an accomplished interviewer, and I was very excited. We had a great lunch, and at the end of it, in passing, she mentioned, you know, her parents met in Shanghai. And I looked at her, and it's possible. I didn't say this at the time, but I'm thinking, you look like, you know, Woody Allen and Barbara Streisand's love child. How is that possible? Your parents met in Shanghai. And she said to me, "You've never heard of the Shanghai Jews." And I was embarrassed to admit I hadn't. And, you know, particularly so because my own family said both, my own parents had both made harrowing escapes from the Holocaust as kids. My mother, as a 4-year-old, got out on the last commercial flight out of Czechoslovakia. Literally, they could have turned her plane around in London. Her family would have been murdered for sure. And as a teen, my father survived in Budapest largely on his wits. He had false papers, and, you know, purely the Nazis ran out of time in Budapest to kill all the Jews there. So there's a lot of luck involved. But they both had brushes with the Holocaust. But Shanghai, I'd never heard of it. And once I did, I couldn't get the idea out of my head. I mean, you have to imagine what Germany in 1938 was like for these German Jews. By that point, the Nazis had brutalized, marginalized, isolated, stolen all the possessions from these poor people. And over half had fled. There were still 250,000 left. And actually another 200,000 more in Austria, because by this time the Anschluss is happening. And the issue was where to go. The Nazis hadn't started murdering them. They actually encouraged them to get the hell out. But after the Evian conference of 1937, they had nowhere to go because the world effectively shut its doors to these Jews. And the Great Depression was on. You know, but unfortunately, there was diplomats didn't equip themselves that well. There was one infamous quote that one is too many when talking about how many they should accept at the time. So just when they thought things couldn't get any worse, they did get a lot worse, and that was on November 9th, Kristallnacht, when really a lot of historians believe that's the beginning of the Holocaust. It marks the official start of the Holocaust. And at that point, the German and Austrian Jews were beyond desperate for escape. And there was one word that was whispered among communities all over Greater Germany at the time, and that was Shanghai. But Shanghai was 12,000 miles away across two oceans. It must have, you know, truly seemed like the end of the earth for these people. But in the late 1930s, Shanghai was a very interesting city. I would say arguably it was the most eclectic, divided, and fascinating city of the 20th century. They called it the Paris of the East at the time. But I would say that more accurately it should have been called the Las Vegas of Asia, because it was the 5th largest city in the world at the time in population, probably the 3rd biggest financial center. It had more opium dens and brothels per capita than anywhere else. And kidnapping was so common, it spawned its own verb out of Shanghai. But the funniest thing about Shanghai at the time is it was so non-Chinese that it had its own Chinatown. People find that hard to believe, but it did. It had this kitschy little fake area, the old city, where you'd go, the Westerners, the Shanghailanders would go to see authentic China, and it was garbage. It was all fake, but that sort of told you a bit about what kind of city it was. And no city better epitomized the world at war at the time than Shanghai. It was a free port city, so every criminal and ne'er-do-well you can imagine had escaped there. It was where the Chinese Communist Party was born in the 1920s. And in this one city, Germans were living beside Jews, communists beside fascists, British and American beside Japanese. I mean, it had it all. And from 1937 to 1941, it was governed by 3 separate sovereignties, none of which were Chinese. You had the British controlling a large international settlement, you had the French controlling an area called Frenchtown, or the French concession, and then the Japanese controlled all the formerly Chinese area that was around the city. So, and that was the reason the Jews could go there. There was no passport control. None of these entities wanted to manage the border. So anybody who could get there could come into Shanghai. So between 1938 and 1940, 20 to 25,000 German Jews arrived on the doorstep. But escaping Europe was no guarantee of survival. It was exotic and alien. The city could be hostile and lethal. There were so many tropical diseases and other ailments that were in the area. It was not the safest place to be or the most welcoming. But the German Jewish culture flourished there. They had shops, the restaurants, theaters, pharmacies. You can see the pictures of them. Sports clubs. They had a soccer team that played right through the war. And synagogues. And it did even have a highly functional refugee hospital, which I've written about in both of my books. But everything changed a lot for the worse for everybody, especially these refugees, on December 7th, 1941, which probably most of you know was the day of Pearl Harbor. And as soon as the Japanese went to war with America, they went to war with all the Allied possessions in Asia, so they rolled over Shanghai on the same day and took over all the areas. But funnily enough, it would still be almost 14 or 15 months. Did everybody see Empire of the Sun? Or read the book, wonderful book. But there's about 15 months between when they took control of the city and when they imprisoned all the Allied with the British families and all the Shanghailanders, as they were called. But they did, they got to it. In 1943, as they were interning all the Allied citizens, the Germans were putting huge demands on them to do something about these Jews. You know, interestingly, the Germans never forgot about these Jews. They're fighting a war on two fronts, and they're starting to lose. But Himmler is a little bit obsessed with these 20,000 German Jews that escaped, and he sent over his highest-ranking Gestapo officer, a guy named Joseph Meisinger, who was so brutal that he was known by his own men as the Butcher of Warsaw. It was an SS nickname. If you're called the Butcher by the other SS men, you might have a few issues. And he tried to convince the Japanese authorities at the time to poison them. They had a few options for getting rid of the Jews of Shanghai. In the end, they decided not to comply. But as a concession to the Germans, in 1943, they ghettoized all the German Jews who were living there. They forced Jews who were living all across the city to move into a 1 square mile area in the city, and that was called the Shanghai Ghetto. And so people who had successful businesses in the international concession in the French town all had to give up their homes and try to find a place to live in this 1 square mile area. Some people couldn't find homes. They ended up living in these hostels called Heime at the time. And yet somehow, despite these constant threats around them, and the threat of starvation and disease and the presence of the Japanese and the Germans, life, commerce, and culture endured in the ghetto. It even flourished for more than 2 years. The Jewish newspapers continued to print. The soccer team continued to play. And so it's my novel, Rising Sun, Falling Shadow, sliding water. Yeah. I tried to capture a glimmer of that spirit that existed in the ghetto at the time. And to be clear, this is a standalone novel. It is not a sequel. I'm representative to my publisher here. I have to be very clear on the reason being, you can pick up this novel without having read the first one. I'm sure there's 1 or 2 of you in here who didn't read my first book, The Far Side of the Sky. And it picks up the story. It's the same characters, but it tells us a very different story, and that's the time of the Shanghai Ghetto in 1943. So it follows the story of the hero, Dr. Franz Adler, who was a very secular German Jewish surgeon from Vienna, and his teenage daughter Hannah, who ended up in Shanghai 3 or 4 years before. He was widowed very young in Vienna, and he meets and falls in love with his wife, Sunyi, or Sunny Adler. Sunyi is one of my favorite characters because she's a Eurasian character, a perpetual outsider in her own city. Her father was a Chinese doctor, her mother was this American missionary. And she'd never felt like she belonged, even in her own town. But she was trained as a nurse, but her father really trained her to be a physician. And she actually becomes a surgeon by this point. Her husband's taught her to be a surgeon. So really, by the time this novel starts, she's functioning as a surgeon. And the Adlers struggle to survive in the ghetto while keeping the city's only hospital afloat. But their threats from outside and inside continue to mount against them. Sunny gets involved with the resistance movement that could prove very lethal. A mysterious Chinese man brought to the hospital represents an even greater threat to them. And Franz's teenage daughter Hannah is drawn into a local smuggling ring. Meanwhile, as the tide of war is turning against the Japanese and the Germans, the local Nazis maintain a menacing, even a lethal interest in sabotaging the local Jews. So this story, I'm going to read from the first chapter. I don't usually read from the first chapter of the novel, because I think it's more impressive if you can get people to like the third chapter of the novel. But I actually happen to like this first chapter, and it's the perfect reading length. It's nice and short. So this introduces Sunny that I was talking about, Sunyi. And it introduces a very important motivator for the rest of the novel. But just as importantly, I think it gives you a realistic sense, I hope, of what Shanghai was like in January 1943. So it starts with her at the hospital. Sunny to almost everyone now, craved a few moments of fresh air. She still had hours to go on her shift and would be alone with the patients once Irma had changed out of uniform. The older nurse was reluctant to leave the refugee hospital, but Sunny insisted. Irma's husband had developed a fever, and like most refugees, she was terrified of malaria. The mosquitoes that carried the parasite were dormant in the wintertime, but the paranoia of it lingered year-round like the stench from Suchow Creek. Still, Sunny had to escape the war, if only for a minute or two. The demands of running a hospital through wartime occupation, the constant shortages of food and medicine, the frequent disruptions of power, and the unexpected seizures of what little supplies they did have weighed on her more heavily than ever, especially today, when the embodiment of all Sunny's frustration and futility lay on a stretcher in the hallway draped by a fraying cotton sheet. Magda Fleischman had died in less than 15 minutes earlier. She was 28 years old, 6 months younger than Sunny. The Schomer, a male volunteer, had already arrived to sit with the body to accompany her soul while awaiting the burial, which by Jewish law had to be conducted within 2 days. Had Frau Fleischman come to the hospital only a week earlier, when the dispensary still possessed a few sulfa pills, her fate might have proven very different. Without those antibiotics, Sunny could do nothing but administer fluids, morphine, and hollow words of encouragement, while the typhoid fever ravaged the young mother of two in front of her eyes. The tragically familiar pea soup odor, the hallmark of typhoid deaths, still hung in the air as a ghostly reminder of the woman's departure. Desperate to escape the smell, Sunny bolted down the hallway, yanked open the door, and stepped out into the afternoon chill. It was not yet 5 o'clock, but the sun, hiding behind the layer of cloud that seemed to permanently enshroud Shanghai this winter, had already begun to set. Sunny heard men shouting in Japanese and froze halfway down the short pathway between the hospital and the street. She blanched when she spotted the source of the commotion. 4 soldiers, their white armband marking them as members of the dreaded Kempeitai, or military police, were shoving 2 boys, maybe 15 or 16 years old, toward the abandoned building across the street. Sunny recognized the taller boy as the son of one of the women on the ward. His face was ashen with terror, but unlike his companion, he silently complied with the Kempeitai men. The other boy's arms flailed as he desperately tried to resist the manhandling. "It was only a prank," he cried. "We were not going to take it." One of the Kempeitai men wheeled and rammed the butt of his rifle into the boy's midsection. The boy clasped his belly and crumpled to his knees. Another soldier grabbed the scruff of his neck and dragged him through the street. "Just a misunderstanding," the boy gasped as he was hauled along. As soon as they reached the wall, the soldiers spun the boys around to face the road. The taller teen's eyes locked onto Sunny's, imploring her to help, but her feet felt as though cast in clay, her tongue as if glued to the roof of her mouth. She had a flashback to the violent night 4 years earlier when she'd been attacked in the street by a drunken Japanese sailor, and the much greater tragedy that had followed. Sunny hid her terror behind what she hoped was a comforting expression, the same one she had offered Magda Fleischman in her last conscious moments. Sunny's chest ached from the shame of her passivity, but she managed to sustain eye contact with the petrified boy. "Stand straight," one of the Kempeitai men barked in English. 2 of the soldiers stood shoulder to shoulder in the street, 10 feet in front of the boys, and simultaneously raised their rifle. Dread overcame Sunny. Her throat tightened. The taller boy began to tremble. His companion raised his arms to shield his chest and face. "Please, please," he whimpered. "Our families were hungry. We have to eat. We're not thieves." The door whooshed open behind Sunny. She glanced over her shoulder to see Irma filling the doorway. The plump woman instantly appreciated what was happening and rushed toward the soldiers without hesitation. Sunny shot a hand out to stop her, but Irma swept past. "Stop!" she shouted. "They're only boys. This is madness." One of the soldiers spun around. The muzzle of his rifle flared twice. Sunny flinched at the crack of gunshot. A cry lost in her throat. Irma dropped to the pavement in mid-stride, as though someone had cut her legs out from beneath her. "God help us," the shorter boy screamed. The rifleman turned back toward the boys. Sunny covered her face, unable to watch. She could hear one of the men calling out in Japanese, and, from his cadence, could tell that he was counting. "No, no, no, no," she muttered. 2 more shots rang in her ears and echoed along the street. A sulfuric smell drifted toward her. In the silence that followed, she kept her eyes squeezed shut, unwilling to face the inevitable. Moments later, Sunny heard footsteps pounding the pavement as the soldiers marched off. Finally, once the worst of her shaking had subsided, Sunny opened her eyes. Irma lay face down in the street. The 2 boys were slumped at the foot of the wall like a pair of discarded rag dolls. So that's why a lot of people are calling it the feel-good novel of the fall. I don't know. Are we good?
We're good.
We're good. I don't know if you want me to read another passage to you guys or just to handle questions. Let's do this democratically. How many people would like to hear another passage? How many people would like to go directly to the Q&A? Sorry, lose.
Daniel, we had planned on saving the last 15 minutes for Q&A with you and Patricia, so you have 15 minutes to read if you want.
Oh, perfect.
Yeah.
I can even read slowly. I don't be silly too long. It's not that long. This novel can, more than that, for those that did read The Far Side of the Sky, this novel contains much more of an element of intrigue and espionage. I really picked up on the theme of the Shanghai resistance, which was quite active, and excuse me, and Sunny in particular later gets involved in this, much to her husband's chagrin. Her husband's very worried about anybody involved with the ghetto being involved with the resistance, and it does, in fact, backfire for them. But I wanted to pick up on the scene, and something very important happens early on in the novel, and that's Ernst, who is a character, one of my favorite characters from the last novel. He was a character I didn't even plan on including, but he was this gay avant-garde artist who had appeared early in one of the Kristallnacht scenes in Vienna, and he was a friend of the Adler family, and he's a Gentile, and he has no time for the Nazis. He's gay himself, but he has no tolerance for them. He can't stand their taste in art, and he's a good friend of the families, and he follows them to Shanghai. He mainly followed them to Shanghai because I liked him so much as a character, and I sent him to Shanghai. But I found a reason to put him there. But he got into all kinds of trouble when he was in Shanghai, and he disappeared. He had to escape to free China in the mountains village, and this is the scene where he comes back to Shanghai. And it starts with France and Sunny being together. They've just had a small fight in the refugee hospital. France opened his mouth, but sudden commotion stopped him before he could speak. Two men were approaching, both wearing drab gray suits. One man was dragging the other, propping him up with an arm around his companion's waist. The man on verge of collapse was Chinese. The other, who had long unruly hair and an uneven beard, looked European. France gawked at the bearded man as though seeing an apparition. "My God, France, are you a sight for sore eyes?" Ernst Müller cried. "Ernst, how is this possible?" France said in surprise. He had not seen or heard from his friend Ernst in over a year. Not since the painter and his lover, a Chinese man named Shan, had escaped Shanghai with the Kempte Tai in full pursuit. The authorities had discovered a series of oils Ernst had painted based on reports of a massacre in Nanking. One painting in particular still haunted France. A woman impaled on a Japanese standard, naked from the waist down, staring plaintively out from the canvas as life seemingly drained away from her eyes. The painting had so enraged and embarrassed the Japanese that execution would have been a mercy had Ernst been captured. He and Shan had fled west to free China in search of the mountainous village where the communist resistance congregated. But France had no reason to believe that they had reached their destination or survived their journey. 100 questions ran through France's head, but the condition of Ernst's companion was his immediate concern. France slid a hand behind the man's back. Together with Ernst, he shuffled him to a nearby vacant stretcher. The man was too weak to climb onto the bed, so France and Ernst had to hoist him. As his fingers brushed over the man's sweaty brow, France instantly recognized a high fever. "Thank you," the man gasped in English as his head flopped back on the mattress. Sunny hurried over to join them at the bedside. "Look at you, Sun Yi," Ernst exclaimed. What a delicious vision you are." Ernst pointed to... Sunny gave him a quick smile, but kept her focus on the ill man. "Where is the infection?" she demanded. Ernst pointed to the man's right leg, and France saw that the material covering it was stained black from blood. Sunny gently rolled up the pant leg to reveal an angry, glistening wound. The man winced, but said nothing as she continued to expose more of his leg. Ernst flicked a finger in the direction of his companion's shoulder. "If that's not damage enough, my unfortunate friend here also took a bullet to the shoulder." "That's nothing," the man murmured, his eyes still closed. France hunched forward to inspect the injured leg. Ignoring the putrid stench, he saw that the thigh just above the knee bulged from a large abscess. As he prodded the skin lightly, his fingers met with resistance. The bullet is still lodged in your thigh, correct? Franz asked, and the man nodded. We will have to remove it and drain it. Of course, doctor, he breathed. Ernst sighed. But we didn't travel over 100 miles and cross enemy lines simply for hospital food, although at this point I wouldn't pass up a meal of any kind. We will feed you both, Ernst. Franz turned back to the other man. What is your name? Chun. The man finally opened his eyes. An arresting almond brown, they showed a glimmer of amusement. Or Charlie, as Ernst insists on calling me. Ernst has not yet managed to rename me, Franz said. I'm Dr. Adler, Franz. Well, here I actually prefer Charlie. Franz didn't understand the distinction, nor did he dwell on it. May I examine your shoulder, Charlie? Sonny helped Charlie remove his jacket and shirt. The exit wound near his shoulder was even larger than the entry wound through the deltoid. The large caliber bullet had clearly missed any vital structures. The wound looked clean and uninfected. Your shoulder will not require surgery, Franz pronounced. But we must operate on your leg immediately. It can't wait. I understand, Charlie said. Unfortunately, our hospital has all but run out of ether. Franz looked away in embarrassment. We do not have enough anesthetic. Do you understand? Charlie mustered a brave smile. It will not be pleasant, I realize, doctor, nor will it be my first operation without anesthetic. Franz glanced at the swollen leg again, wondering if gangrene had already set in. I cannot promise that we'll be able to save the leg. Charlie closed his eyes again. He nodded once. What has to be done has to be done. Two nurses arrived at the bedside. As they prepared Charlie for the operating room, Franz and Sonny led Ernst to the staff room. Once inside, Sonny threw her arms around their friend and hugged him fiercely. Franz clapped the artist's shoulder, feeling only bone. Above the tawny beard, gray in patches, his cheeks had hollowed, but despite his scrawniness, Ernst somehow still looked robust. His once pale complexion had become ruddier, and his eyes burned as brightly as ever. Not a word in over a year, Franz said. I had assumed the worst, my friend. And who says you weren't right to, Ernst said. Have you ever spent a year of your life in a backwater Chinese village? Trust me, it doesn't get much worse. You're home, Sonny pointed out. Home? I have no idea where that is, Ernst smiled. But by God, of all my deprivations from civilization, what I miss most is a little gossip. He looked pointedly at Franz and Sonny. So, tell me, what have you two? Sonny raised her left hand to show Ernst the wedding band that had once belonged to Esther's grandmother. Ernst clutched his chest theatrically. I knew it. You see? Love can still prevail, even in this godforsaken place. Speaking of love, Sonny said, where's Shan? Still in the village, Ernst said. He had a bad fall. Sometimes we were forced to travel in the darkness. He broke his ankle. Is it serious? He'll recover. Ernst looked away. I left without telling him. Shan would have insisted on trying to come with us, but his injury was too serious. Sonny touched Ernst's cheeks. You were only protecting him. Well, to be honest, I was protecting myself, Ernst said. It was hard enough getting Charlie here on that game leg of his. I've come to understand that behind enemy line, 2 legs are a distinct advantage. He breathed out with a sigh. Sadly for me, my Shan is not always the forgiving kind. Franz eyed the artist. Who is Charlie? A trusted friend, Ernst said, suddenly serious. He looks familiar, Sonny said. His English is good, but he's not from Shanghai, is he? His accent. Ernst ran a hand through his dirty blonde hair. Trust me, the less you both know about Charlie, the better. But you brought him here, Franz said, to our hospital. I didn't want to. Believe me, I had no choice. Ernst shook his head helplessly. I would make the world's absolute worst doctor, but even I could see that Charlie would die if we left him in the village. I could think of nowhere else to turn. You were right to bring him here, Sonny said. Franz nodded. We might be able to save his leg yet. It's always the same with us. A pained smile crossed Ernst's face. You helped me, and I repay the kindness by endangering you even more. And in spite of that, we still missed you, Franz said. Of course you did, Ernst said with exaggerated panache. Parasite or not, my appeal is irresistible. Will you stay, Sonny asked? Only until Charlie is well enough to travel again. That will be a long while, Franz said. Meantime, isn't it terribly dangerous for you to be in Shanghai? Ernst waved the suggestion away. Sexual picadillos aside, I'm a German Gentile, a purebred Aryan. I could not be more welcome here. The Japanese adore us. They certainly do not adore you. They'll never recognize me. And if they do, the levity drained from Ernst's face. I'll tell you this, my friends, we will have far bigger problems if they recognize Charlie. You know what? I should shut up, but I just say that, you know, what I love about this novel and why I stick with it and the story of this history is that it's one of the few, you know, contrary to my readings today, it's one of the few uplifting stories of the Holocaust. These German Jews escaped and largely survived under surreal circumstances. And they did so with, you know, a dignity, and a dignity that was reflected by their Chinese neighbors who were brutally oppressed in the same city. And these two oppressed people lived side by side in this tiny little area, crammed in with no animosity, and there's no recorded incidents of prejudices between the group or any acts. And it really is, I think it's an amazing piece of history, and sadly not one that's not well known, and I think it's well worth knowing. So, thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. So we do have some time for questions for both Daniel and Patricia. Patricia, if you want to come up here. Does anyone have any questions?
Why isn't it so well known?
Why isn't it so well known? I don't know. You would think, you know, I would have thought some Hollywood producer or somebody would be all over it, and especially since there's a very famous Hollywood producer who was born in Shanghai, named Mike Medavoy, and he's actually developing apparently, unfortunately he's not developing my novel, but he's developing a novel into a movie about it. But it's, like it seems, you know, sometimes I had to literally downplay the drama because it wouldn't, some of the facts just seemed too, you know, it was the kind of where fiction being stranger than reality, and reality being stranger than fiction. And so, I mean, it's just amazing, the anecdotes and stuff. So I don't know the answer to that.
Is there still a large community of Jewish people in Shanghai?
No, but it wasn't because of the war, it was because of the Communist Revolution when Mao came in. Basically all foreigners were gone, so by 1949 they weren't. But they're coming back. There's now the synagogue that I write about, it became a museum, and the Chinese are very proud of their heritage, and they should be, and their role in protecting these Jews. And so it's a beautiful museum that you can visit if you go to Shanghai. And they now actually have services on, like, you know, Yom Kippur and Rosh Hashanah, the high holidays. So there's a big enough community for that, but there is no indigenous Jewish population.
Did you go to Shanghai before you wrote this? That's one thing. And when did you finish the novel?
Oh, okay.
No, not the date. When did the novel finish? Sorry.
Okay.
Yeah.
I can't remember the day then. No, but I looked very closely on Google Maps at Shanghai for a long time. No, I didn't. I went to Shanghai. I spent 10 days there. It was amazing, touring around, and it was incredible. And it was because I had done so much research before we got there. I get lost clearly in North Vancouver, but I also get lost in downtown Vancouver. But once I got to Shanghai, I'm dragging my bike around all the old section. I knew the streets because I'd been poring over the maps. So yeah. So this book ends, you know, it was supposed to be one book, one for the whole war, and I've turned it into a bit of a franchise. This book ends, it only covers the year 1943, and I'm now working on the final installment in the trilogy that will go to the end of the war.
Many of the many of the Jews went to Japan after the war, in fact.
Did they?
Yeah, I met many there when I lived there.
That's interesting. I didn't know that. I know the biggest percent went to America and Israel, and then Canada and Australia were quite the common destination, but Japan too. That's interesting.
You mentioned the personal contact that got you started on the book. Did you, amongst your research, did you have personal contact? You know, people that had been in Shanghai or children of, etc.
Yeah, that's a good question. I tried to contact a few people and it didn't work out, but since the book was written, I've met a few people. You know, I was reading at a synagogue after the first book, and somebody came up and said, "My mom wants to meet you, but she's got bad arthritis. She can't get up. Can you?" So I came down to where she was sitting, and she was probably in her 90s. She was an adult in the time in Shanghai, and she had read my novel. She was sharp as a tack, and so I was very nervous. Like, oh my God, what did you? And I said, you know, so what did you think? Did it ring true? And she said, I want to thank you. You brought back a lot of happy memories of Shanghai. So I was good. I felt very validated with my research.
How did you choose the character of Alphonse and the other ones? Are there familiar notes to reality?
Yeah. I don't know, Patricia, well, that's about choosing characters. I try never to use people I know, And I always say that I don't know where these characters particularly come from. I'm sure they're based on a slight diversion, a true story. People are very proprietary about names. In my first book, Pandemic, I had this character who wasn't the most likable character. She wasn't a villain, but she was kind of a mid-level obstructive bureaucrat, and she had this name. And it was a name, and my editor said at the end, she goes, that name sounds too much like one of the main characters, you have to change the name. So I did, I changed the name to a rather unusual name, but it was after I'd written the novel. And then I went to work, and there's a very funny nurse who happens to have the same first name, and she's just glaring at me. She goes, I read your book, and she said, you put me in the book. And I said, I didn't put you in the book. She goes, you did. And she said, none of that. She goes, you made me a frumpy middle-aged bitch who never gets laid. I'm very careful about first names. The interesting thing about that is the character's name is Franz, and my father read the first draft of the first book, and he passed away before it was published. But my father, as a son-in-law, grew up in Budapest and stuff, and I had no idea that how much of my father was in the character, because a cousin called me and said, you wrote about your dad. I said, I didn't write about my dad. And he said, well, what's the character's name? I said, Franz. He said, it's kind of like, and my dad's name is Frank. He said, what'd the character do? He said, he's a surgeon. Your dad was a trainer. And everything he started to say was true of my dad. And my dad had that same fierce ethics and loyalty and just pig-headed. Oh my God, was he pig-headed and stuff. And just like the character in the novel. So there was a ton of my father in that character.
Patricia, did you want to answer that question too?
Sure. In my second book, Tim, Cookie, and a Matter of Security, I have a contest at the very end. Can you guess how many prime ministers' names were used in the book? Because I used a lot of them, but I won't tell you how. You have to look through it yourself. And so there's a contest for the first 3 readers who guess the correct number. And I had a character also in Tim and Cookie, and my editor, I guess it was the editor's graphic designer, said, oh, you can't use that name. That person was quite a bandit in Quebec. And I said, well, that isn't what I meant. It's just a nice name that I picked out. It was a name from my childhood, my father's buddy. And she said, oh no, you can't use that. He's well known. I lived in Quebec, and that's a name. You don't want to have that name in there for that character. So we changed that, so it became Louis Saint Laurent. So it might give you a hint.
One more.
For Patricia, are you working on anything new?
Yeah, I usually spend about 6 months to a year on research, and I've just finished something, I hate to even give clues, but something from the 1860s. And I have a character in mind, I have a family the character has, I have a job for the character, and but I usually write in my head for a long time. Think about it, and before I put anything on paper. My husband is here. He always says, how come you can sit down and write 20 pages in one shot? And it's because it's been in my head percolating for a long time.
So you're coming from 1860s to like 2060, and that's quite big blast. They say I switch around a lot when I read. That's quite a span you're doing. The genres are changing.
Thank you. It's history. So as I said, I didn't know that was my genre till I was told by a reviewer. So I thought, okay. So I enjoy the research as much as the writing. So I might as well go with it.
Thank you so much, Daniel and Patricia. Let's give them a big round of applause. And I wanted to save us some time so that everyone could have a glass of wine, buy some books, get some books signed. Please do. And we will see you again sometime soon. Our next reading of the series is November 27th. It's a night of poetry. You can find more information about that online or in our WhatsApp program guide, which was on your chair. Thank you so much, everyone, and have a wonderful night.